Well, hello, everybody. My name is John Barnwell, and I'm here in the greater Detroit metropolitan area with my greatest teacher and my most amazing pupil, Dr. Douglas Gabriel, and we're venturing into our latest episode of interviews with an exorcist. And ring goes the bell. How you doing there, Douglas?
That's right. He comes out of his corner and he's coming towards the middle of the
And in this corner.
That's right, because we're fighting evil here. We turned the exorcisms from individual to global now. And some time ago, my beautiful wife said, why don't you just do an exorcism on the world? Because the whole world needs it. And I'm going, okay. So we started our work and we've been doing it ever since. So in a way, what we're talking about now with this whole Detroit group, it's kind of like a gentle exorcism. I mean, coming into the Mayflower and meeting you working there, first off, any knowledge that you thought you had is going to pale. And then John's going to hand you all these books, that you could then advance yourself for years to come, perhaps for 10, 20 years. If you take these books he's giving you, it was like Kathleen Kennedy when she came to the Mayflower. I had already sent her, over 20, 30 boxes of books because they were supposedly going to Spielberg, right? And they ended up in Skywalker Ranch Library. And not too long ago, someone was there and said, I didn't believe you. I checked it out, but the Mayflower stamp is in 9 out of 10 books in George Lucas's Skywalker Ranch Library, which is, I've been told, is quite impressive. Well, here is the person who got those books to them. And eventually she came to the Mayflower and, was able to take away even more books. But the point is that in those days, when you came into the Mayflower, as I've said before, there was a sign up that said, "Beware, truth is spoken here. Hard hats are required." Because that's what it was. And if buddy, in our reverie here, if we make it look like it was just a tripping along down a primrose path, that is not what the Manasic Club was. It was crack brain fire philosophers smashing their heads together to see if we could come up with a solution to any question that any of the four of us made. And by the way, because we keep talking about these people, look what I found. I look at this every single day. Okay. You see there? That's Bobby. Of course, there's John. Next to John is Brian kissing me because he thinks he's funny. And then there's me. Then there's Howard, the painter. And there's Bobby Hankins, this person we've been talking about so much. And this painting behind me, right there, this guy whose nose I'm pointing at, Howard painted that in a psychic fit. At one point, he was trying to make some money because, his paintings used to go for $20,000, but now they weren't. And so he said, I got to have a new gig. So we sat around talking and he goes, okay, that's it. People say I paint the spirit in them. So I will do spirit paintings. And I said, yeah, that's it. You just go into a trance and paint. Whatever you see is their spirit, not what you see before them, but what you see inside of them. And so I sat for this one there. And of course, my hair was long. You can't tell it, but my hair is down to my waist. And I'm wearing a cape with a hood. And he said, oh, no, I want you to dress just the way you always dress, because then it's something out of a different time period. So just sit the way you normally are, but keep your cape on, your hooded cape, and I'm going to paint you. So he went into a fit. Now, Howard smoked, okay? And he would put a cigarette in his mouth, light it, and smoke the whole thing down without even touching it while he's looked like this and he's painting. And it was amazing because I watched him. That is the 5th rendition he did of me. It took about 2 hours, but he painted over the previous 4 because he didn't like them. So he painted and he in a fit. And then I'd sneak around to look at it and I go, oh, that's really good. And he goes, no, it's all wrong. And then he'd start all over again. And so he did this for quite a few people. So sometimes you can find a, what did he call them? A spirit painting or a psychic painting, right? And they have a certain phenomena to them. If you could see this in person, because of his chiaroscuro, his effect of light that's kind of coming from nowhere, coming out of the being itself instead of shining on the being. So there's a certain kind of light that happens there, a certain kind of flame. Well, this one, remember, this is the one that people, for a long time, when he had it up in his living room, they'd look at it and they'd cry. And he got so tired of them crying that he moved it to his bedroom so nobody could see it. And then one day he just says to me, I've had this long enough. You have to take this because it's it's a snapshot of your spirit back in those days. So that's what I looked like before. And now look at me. You can't even tell the same person. But Howard was an amazing person. He was very psychic. Parts of it he knew, parts of it he just channeled. The picture I showed last time of the cat goddess of Egypt, that whole thing, it was channeled. He didn't even know what he was putting on the page. He just connected to the spirit and did it. And so he was on the kind of the outskirts of the Manasic Club, the four of us, John, myself, Brian Lynch, and Robert Thibodeau, who I want to talk about Robert Thibodeau quite a bit today, and astrology. And always Bobby was there, but and Howard was there. And Nancy Beecham says I have to include her because yes, she kicked her way, fought her way with whatever weapon it took to get into Manasic Club meetings so that she could express her ideas about these things, right? And anyone was welcome to. Just good luck, because if you said something that was inaccurate, well, one of these people would turn on you and tell you point blank, And Brian was an absolute genius. He knew all about every book there was because he ran a bookstore, but he had studied the esoteric of the occult, but he was an astrologer. And he was an amazing astrologer because he used sidereal astrology, right? Well, he doesn't do it anymore.
He doesn't do it, but he's
Yes.
still amazing. Yeah.
If you can get Brian on the phone, it'll be worth your time. That's a fact. His last video that he did with Alan Pittman, last time I saw it, had over 1.5 million hits. Brian had warmth in his voice that really demonstrated he had a beautiful heart. And so when he'd give you a reading, he was so kind that he might read you so long that you can't believe it. He could go on and on and on.
And he's a jack of hearts.
Absolutely, that's right. I forgot. He is.
We're 3 days in a row. It was Brian's birthday. The next day was mine, and the day after that was Howard's.
Exactly. Our triplets there, and all of you are nice people. So I really want to thank the group for accepting me in, because I was anything but I don't know, cordial, or I was very intense, and I don't know. I was going to ask, in your perspective, because I don't have your perspective. From the way I was when you first met me, a crazy, wild psychic who never heart slowed down and was, completely choleric. I weighed at 105 pounds, thin as a rail, and totally intense, right? I mean, I was terribly intense. And so people were terrified of me, but they also loved me. So wherever I go, they just go, "You're in charge now."
Yes. Well, at the time, to give you an encapsulation, Douglas would say, "Do you know what this means?"
Like I knew what it meant. Yes, exactly. I was always trying to convince somebody of something, right? Oh yeah. So I'm sure that, but at the same time, I was called on to do the most amazing stuff from the Catholic Church, from the Mayflower, from different groups I was associating with, and also as a reader, because once I got connected with the Mayflower and became a reader, oh man, then I was like let loose in the world like a conflagration. It was frightening. Nobody I met that I didn't give him any reading to. Every single person I encountered, I would give a reading to, right? And I wanted to get it to the point that it was 100% accurate, which is kind of hard to do. So I had to bend the rules, and poor John had to witness me bastardizing the card system and coming up with my own interpretation and my own overlays from all the readings I did, and from looking at people as I told them things, I could psychically see whether it was true. So I use that same thing with astrology. Now, when I was a teenager, I was into some very strange things. I got a degree or certification to be a Swedish masseuse so that I could work with chiropractors in their office to do massages, because I was always making tons of money. I wanted to do anything except be at home. And the other thing I did was I was a parliamentarian. I've told that before, $75 an hour. And I'd put on my three-piece suit and I was in charge of meetings and I'm a teenager. Someone had to drive me to the meeting, but I was in charge of a meeting with thousands of people creating their charter or whatever.
Robert's Rules of Order.
Memorized it. Robert's Rules of Orders, newly revised. I could tell you not only the quote it, but I could tell you the page it was on, and I carried that to prove it. So I don't know if you know what that means, but a parliamentarian controls meetings by making sure it's in the proper order. So I realized early on there are certain things you can learn that can get you in anywhere. One of them was photography. So I got a press card. I could walk in anywhere. I just put a press card on my body somewhere, walk in with cameras, and you can do any darn thing you want. No one will ever stop you. You don't have to work for the press. Yes.
Well, yeah, I used to have an approach like that with concerts. And, I walked up, I was on the stage for the Rolling Stones when they played Detroit in 1969 because I went to the door and ended up getting in, and they actually invited me to stay with the tour, helping out Chip Monk, who was people would remember him. He was the announcer at Woodstock.
Oh,
right? Yeah. Beware of the blue mescaline guy. That guy.
Oh, yeah. Public service announcements. Yes.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that guy. But anyways, getting back, because the Manasic Club, the ferment, it wasn't a kumbaya moment. It was more of a booyah.
Kumbaya boom moment. And I could get in anywhere as long as I was with Bobby, if it was, modern music, or you, or Robert, or with Faith, to anything classical. So Bobby introduced me to Eric Clapton, I don't know, 3-4 times. He introduced me to Paul Simon, though Paul Simon ended up being in Gaelic Rinpoche's Jewel Heart Temple, and would come to Ann Arbor and come to the retreat. So I got to know Paul very well as Richard Gere and Allen Ginsberg and Robert Thurman and Patti Smith and all these people. They were all part of Gaelic Rinpoche's Jewel Heart Temple. But with Bobby, he got me backstage to meet Eric Clapton a few times, and Edie Brickell and Paul Simon. And they asked me, strangely enough, because they knew I was a Waldorf teacher, I'd talk anthroposophy with them, and they asked me to teach their children. They both had children who were at that moment in 5th grade. And I honestly considered moving down to Ohio to teach these 2 children, because they were in this kind of secret community that there were more people in. I can't even tell you that, and that's not the case anymore, so I can say these things. And then they got a tour offer, so they went to Europe and took the children with them on a boat and went around, and I didn't want to do that. So I got through Bobby to meet all these people, but I got to meet astrologers through the Mayflower, and Robert and yourself, you're an astrologer. Brian was a master astrologer. He was somewhat of an astrosopher, Steiner's kind of astrology, but he was also sidereal, so the fixed stars, but he understood the most complicated aspects of astrology, especially cosmological aspects. So Brian was like a mundane astronomer. Robert was like a mundane astronomer, had a record for probably more accurate predictions than even anyone else, including Gene Dixon, by the way, who I met. I'll tell that story at some point. And Robert knew all the major astrologers because he'd go to these conventions. I went with him to these conventions, and I would use the card, and I would drive these people nuts. I'd go up to Robert Hand or Michael Earlywine. These are the major people, or you name it. These are international astrologers and national in conferences. And my deal was I'd go up, elbow my way in and say, "What's your birthday? Don't tell me the year." And they'd look at me like, "Well, you can't derive anything astrological from my birthday and not the year, you fool. I'll tell you my birthday." So they tell me their birthday, and I'd say, "Oh, well, you have Jupiter and Saturn highly aspected in your chart, as a matter of fact." And then I start giving them a reading, and they'd go, wait, stop. No one can know that by asking my birthday and not the year. And so literally between Robert and I, we turned all these astrologers, I can't count how many, onto using the card, your system that you taught me from Only Richmond, which then enhanced their readings tremendously. So what I was about to say a long time ago was, when I was a teenager, I was always making money. And one of the things that I had heard about was astrology. So I went to study astrology. But in Springfield, Missouri, where I was from, there were 5 Bible colleges. So to practice or to teach astrology in Springfield, Missouri was illegal. Illegal, okay? So I studied with the best astrologer in town, but it was all underground. And it was with his mother and father, who were amazing people. His father studied the book of Owaspie, and his mother studied the book of Urantia, and they were like experts on it. And then their son was like the best astrologer around. You're going, wow. And they were bizarre but amazing people. So I studied with them, and it would be he was so powerful that he barely came outside much at all, because whatever he said would happen. One night he's teaching, and he's going on about Uranus-Mars conjunction. And he says, it's not only, saying something you don't shouldn't be saying, going too far, unexpected electrical charge of Uranus, and then the Mars speech, dance, emotion. He goes, but this is a car wreck. I'm telling you, Uranus, Mars is a car wreck. And just as he yells this at us, yeah, a car wrecks right outside. And I go out, and 5 young people were in the car. And as I went to each one of them breathed their last breath and died. And so I was there saying prayers for them as they crossed over the threshold. The other people wouldn't come out of the room to help. And so I was out there by myself trying to, trying to pull them out of the car, but you couldn't get them out of the car. I was afraid the car was going to start on fire. But that has happened to me more times than I can count. At least 3, 4, 5 people I have given artificial respiration to. They came back, and so when I was in Hawaii, every once in a while, these people would show up and say, "Come on, it's the day. It's the day you saved my life. I'm taking you to dinner." Because for whatever reason, all my life, car wrecks happen like right in front of me since I was a child. And I would go out, and I don't know, I'd pray for them as I'd watch them go across the threshold. So I've watched many people, and I also worked in hospice. So I've watched many people die right in front of me as I was praying for them, and watched their transition, which is very helpful. And it taught me what that looks like, so that I could recognize it in other people also. So I studied astrology before I ever came to Detroit. But the Mayflower was not only the center of astrology. Robert was one of the most active and recognized astrologers in the country, and had, again, as I say, more accurate predictions than anybody. For many years, he got the choice of the president. What? How many years was it? It was like forever. I think, I don't even know if he ever got it wrong. Okay, so he has a way of looking at the American chart and figuring it out and saying, "Yep, this is what's going to happen." Looks at the charts of the individuals. But why do I bring this up? Because that's what an exorcist does. Is an astrologer not an exorcist? That's my premise.
Well, if you get into if you try and break it down, you'll find in the work of Rudolf Steiner a very strong indication. And that I've made mention of it before, but it's something you can't say often enough, because it clarifies everything so much. And he gets into talking about how there was these, like he says here, originally there were 4 traditional faculties, namely philosophy, theology, jurisprudence, and medicine. And the rest have been added based on utter unenlightenment and misunderstanding. Faculties for such subjects as political science, national economy, and the like originated from thoughts which no longer knew anything at all of the essentials. So when you get in and you break that down to what he says with the Gospel of Matthew, that's the theologian. The Gospel of Mark, that's the jurist. Luke, the physician, and John, the philosopher. And that in coming to a cosmic understanding of the Christ impulse, you can go to those 4 fixed signs. Matthew is the man or the angel, and Mark is the lion, Luke is the bull, and John is the eagle. So you have the 4 fixed signs of the zodiac. But there's this cosmic understanding that you have to get to approach it from the vantage point that someone like Brian Lynch would make reference to, for example, in that there's this whole idea that we are an expression of that macrocosm. And it's not this like mechanistic, all these astrologers try to come up with this, well, there's very subtle gravity and this is affecting this. They go off and all this because they're trying to fit it in their way of looking at the world. And it doesn't take into account what the ancient astrologers of Chaldea and Egypt and so forth were actually relating to cosmic intelligences.
And John was the cosmological astrologer, can you tell? And I was the psychic astrologer. As a matter of fact, when I worked at the Mayflower, Robert gave me the opportunity to do all readings, all shows, and run the Mayflower bookshop, the most incredible occult bookshop, esoteric bookshop in the English-speaking world, and to run our Wizards New Age video shop, which had hundreds, I don't know how many hundreds, of every single master and great teacher, everyone who ever made a video. And those back in the days when big old videos, not little videos. And so you'd rent them out. So we had Wizards New Age video, and Robert and I made 24 tapes, self-help spiritual tapes, and made 10,000 copies or something of them, and hired someone to do the publicity and all that. So Wizards New Age video, for a while, Robert and I were famous in Europe because these things sold like hotcakes. We sold out before the year was over. And so I was also in charge of that, and also in charge of the Om Macrobiotic restaurant, which Colleen, his wife, who's also an astrologer and also was in our group, and sometimes, but she didn't put up with our silly male ego stuff. So she didn't have time for us, debating stupid stuff. But the point is, she was a good astrologer. She had a macrobiotic restaurant, excellent place. And so for that year, I was in charge of all 3. And basically, one day, it used to be when I was a teenager, remember, John, the book, The Complete Astrologer, that it was a coffee table book. And if you had it out on your coffee table in your house, then you could talk astrology with people. And in the old days, John, remember when you'd walk in someone's house, what was the first thing you or I would do? Go look at their bookshelf. Then you knew who you were talking to, right? And it was just you could immediately just strike up a conversation with, oh, I see you like Alice Bailey. So when we're talking about there's some subtle aspect of Alice Bailey, you could jump right into a conversation with these people. But that book taught you astrology. You had to do your own math on it. I was terrible at it, and I hated it, and it turned me off to astrology. But in the days that I worked at the Mayflower, you hand me a chart, I could give a great reading from that chart. One time I gave a reading that was the wrong chart, and the lady walked out and said it was the best reading I ever had in my life. I'm going, well, thank you very much. I was looking at the wrong chart. Bob had handed me the wrong person's chart. Okay? That's how I do things. I read them and I manipulate them so that I can use my psychic perception to get in there and kind of hide the fact that that's what I'm really doing, because that kind of freaks people out.
It's called a prop.
Yeah, it's a prop. It is. It's like, show me your hand. Yeah, I'm reading their palm. I know how to read palms, but that's not all I'm reading, just the way the shape of the hand, there's a whole way you can read everything about a person. So the point is, I was never an astrologer, but man, can I give a good reading. And I'll tell you the secret to it. Don't get complicated. Don't get into Chiron and the asteroids and the midpoints and the incredible subtleties. But, if you're smart and you want to look at the eclipses while you're in utero, excellent. If you want to look at the eclipses in your entire life so that you can actually figure out super spiritual things about yourself, great. If you want to, Bob is a tropical astrologist, I would say. Brian was a sidereal, and then you're kind of like heliocentric, and I was kind of just a crazy psychic, right? So, uh,
And
but
then, Bobby Hankins' wife, Cheryl,
oh,
it was one of the top Uranian cosmobiologists in the world, which is a German form of detailed astrology. I have all the books right over here, but with the the Uranian system, with the trans-Uranian planets, trans-Neptunian planets, these transiting points that worked. Were based. This was based upon investigation of events, which is interesting because Rudolf Steiner does say you can't really approach astrology from that kind of a standpoint because that is not the key to understanding what I just mentioned about the ancient Chaldean and Egyptian coming from the celestial intelligence. See, so you have to understand that there are different phases within the chronology of astrology and how it organically developed, and you go into the Greco-Roman period, and then you get into the Ptolemy and all the computational approach to astrology, where as opposed to clairvoyant observation. So I mean, it's one of the most fascinating subjects that you could study.
yes, the astrologers who use a lot of math, a lot of midpoints, a lot of so many details. It's overwhelming. I don't think you need all that. What was her? She used the wheel. Was that Eberhard? What was that guy's name?
No, you had Reinhold
Reinhold.
Everton, and then
Eberton. Yeah.
his son Balder. Now I met Balder. I never met Reinhold, but yeah,
Hmm.
he came up with the cosmobiology and the wheel, and you could take the zodiac and then fold it in on itself, so to speak, so that you'd have like a 90-degree wheel instead of a 360. You'd fold the quadrants in, and it was like a microscope. We'd sit there and watch football games, and we'd be rotating it, and it slowly moves around. You got like the aspect coming up, and then it hit, and the guy get tackled and taken off the field. Right at a critical midpoint, stuff like it was just very, very bizarre because it does work, but the key thing to get from our conversation here is that trying to explain why. Now that's a whole nother matter because you're getting into the whole idea of the Lepikas and karma and all these things that you can't see that are playing into the unfolding of your skandhas, as they would say in Oriental understanding, so that you have this amazing balancing act. But mind you, Charles Jane used to stay at my house when he come to town. He's the father of modern scientific astrology. And he looked like W.C. Fields, and he was about 6'6". And he'd have a red sport coat on, and he'd go, Barnwell, we really don't know that much about astrology. Here you are. This is guy. He's the guy that contributed including the vertex, which is a mathematically generated point into the horoscope, and it's tied into very much inevitable karma, so to speak. And but we had such a good time back then.
Yeah, he was one of the greats, and I was more into the astronomy aspect of it and feeling these things instead of doing the math. You could go to Cheryl Swanson's house, Bobby Hankins' wife, and one day she was there and she was demonstrating the wheel to somebody, I forget what, and she literally told him everything that had happened to him that day up until that time. By turning the wheel and going, then about an hour later, this happened. Then there was, looks like there were 5 men discussing you behind closed doors, and you weren't there. And she goes, "That's exactly right." She just went right through, dialed it right up, and told you exactly. It was like when you with your expert friends who did the cards could lay out the daily card spread and tell hour by hour what's going to happen. Now, here's the problem. And this is the problem also with psychics, or this would be a problem also with exorcism. You can't count on somebody else to give you what you need to derive yourself. And so people would become addicted to Cheryl because then they'd want a reading every day. They'd want a reading every week. And I'm going to not mention the people, but there were people who became addicted to Brian, addicted to Cheryl. And so I learned my lesson early on, and I'll tell you about that in a second. But they would use the readers, astrology especially, because it's so darn accurate. It's astoundingly accurate. I'll tell you a few stories that demonstrate that. I could bring in anybody in my family and say, how many times have I predicted the thing was going to happen right down to the very day, if not the very time, and exactly what was going to happen, a year ahead of time, because I looked at astrology. So I don't have to use psychic ability anymore. And somebody came. It is happening all the time. As a matter of fact, since we started these, people are saying, "Can you help me?" They send me a personal message. This is going on. Can you tell me if the person is obsessed or possessed? And can you help me get rid of? Well, no. Here's the deal. You don't want to get addicted to somebody doing the work of your own I am, your own ego. You don't give away your free will to somebody telling you what to do, no matter whether they use astrology, they're psychic, they're a priest, it doesn't matter. That is the worst thing you could do. It'd be better for you to make a mistake than to be afraid and follow the advice of your reader and live a narrow life instead of living life to its fullest, because everything can be mitigated by the Lord of Karma, by Christ. So no matter what happens, astrology inclines you. It doesn't make it happen. And when you read, you say, well, it could, okay, you have a Saturn conjunct Uranus. And let's say you have transiting Saturn, the Saturn in the sky that's moving right now is sitting on top of that position in your chart where Uranus was when you were born. What's going to happen? Well, it could be that you get fired. Could be that you get a super promotion. So, sorry, that's the same exact aspect, right? But you have to decide. And when Cheryl or Brian or Robert or yourself or myself, when we look at these things, we'd have to add a little bit of our own insight, or it really wouldn't work that well. And that's the reason that there are so many astrologers with so many different methodologies. You listen to 10 astrologers on one day about a certain aspect and you get 10 different views. But eventually, we got to meet Robert Hand, the guy who wrote the book that most of the computer astrology interpretations come from. Robert Hand and his group of astrologers. We met all those people. But you knew astrosophers. I knew Willie Suker. That was the astrologer who took anthroposophy, merged them with Rudolf Steiner's help, and Willie Suker was an astrosopher, and he started teaching out in California, and his major student was Willie Bento, who you can tell us about.
Well, yeah. Willie, he wrote the foreword to my second book, The Arcana of Light on the Path. See, I have pages marked. I do read my own books, by the way, and they're tools. But yeah, Willie Suker is what a fascinating guy with his astrosophy. And during the World War II, there was a group of anthroposophists that were interred on the Isle of Man during the duration of the war, and it included Willie Suker and Karl Koenig and numerous other anthroposophists. And they figured, well, we're here, we might as well teach each other what we know. And so it became this academy on the Isle of Man, and they all learned astrosophy, and he learned curative education from Karl Koenig, and they all cross-pollinated all of their various aspects of Rudolf Steiner's teachings and studies and all the various disciplines that he worked in. And so keep that in mind, because if you go to someone like Karl Koenig and his Earth and Man, for example, one of the most incredible books that you could possibly read, in my mind. very humbly speaking. I've only seen several million books, and this is one of those books that just rises to the top, because if you can understand what he thinks he means, you've come a long way.
There's often clusters of groups. There was a cluster of a group that was somewhat like Detroit. A very rich lady was it Stourbridge or Scarborough or Starborough or something like that in England, and Willie Willie Bento and Robert Powell and Michael French, and then later when they came to America and went out to Colorado and created the Star House, there were a number of other people who joined them, and they still to this day they created the Sophia Foundation. And Robert Powell wrote numerous books, very detailed astrological books. He himself actually was a scientist, but a lot of his predictions are incorrect. So when you look at his books and you read them, you go, well, that was very nice to think that, Obama was Ahriman, or, this or that, or he made certain predictions about times and things that would happen, and they didn't. And so the proof is in the pudding. If you are a prophet, here's how it worked in the Old Testament. When you were right, you got to live. When you were wrong, they killed you.
Well, see, all he needed to do was add 2 letters to what he said. When he said Obama is Ahriman. Well, Obama is Ahrimanic. You just add the I and the C on the end, and then it becomes correct. So you can approach certain things. And Max Heindel, who was a student of Rudolf Steiner's at one time, he founded the Rosicrucian Fellowship in California. And Max Heindel's not his real name, by the way, but they have this incredible campus out in California. And he said, the stars impel, they don't compel.
Exactly. And it goes back to a point you made earlier and is really my point today. Okay, you're an astrologer. Now, let me tell you just 2 quick stories. My son, I was teaching him a little bit of the card system and a little bit of astrology. One day he asked me, because I look at people's charts when there's problems, anytime my wife tells me to, as a matter of fact. I never ever do it otherwise. I never look at my chart. I don't even know my own chart. I'd have to look at it to even tell you anything about it, because astrologers tend to base the whole world upon their chart, and everybody else is a relationship to their chart. And I hate that. That's just so egotistic to think that in the cosmos, you believe that you are the standard. No, you're an individual. So I don't really get into all that. But my son said, well, Dad, now you were looking at these charts. Can you tell when someone's going to die? I said, sometimes you can. It depends. It's an indication. There might be that we could look at a certain aspect and say, yes, maybe at that time they might die, or because Saturn is involved, maybe Saturn, Uranus, Saturn, Pluto, blah, whatever. But there might be some other mitigating circumstances, and there's always free will. He says, so you can tell me when you're going to die? Because he was going to India, and he was going to be gone a while. And I guess he wanted to know if I was going to die while he was gone, because I was sick at the time. So I said, oh, well, I don't usually do that, but for you, because he is an incredible son. I looked it up and I said, oh, well, here's what will happen. It's going to look like I'm going to die. Matter of fact, I'm going to come pretty kind of close, but it's okay. I'll live through it. And he goes, what are you talking about? I said, well, in this date to this date, yeah, it's very likely that, don't get upset. Don't get upset. It's going to look like I'm going to die. Matter of fact, I'll be very close to death, but it's all right. And so he wrote that down. Later, to make a long story short, he when that did happen, I went to the hospital, had the heart attacks, and went on dialysis, blah, 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 blah. Then he came back and he said, I have the dates right here. You were absolutely right. My wife was worried about this a couple years before I got sick. And she says, can you tell me this about yourself? I want to know. I want to know how long you're going to be with me. Because, I'm sure she had something funny to say about all of that. Because, by my health, it looks like I'd predeceased her. She wanted to know when. So I said, I hate to do this, but I looked it up. Same thing. I gave her the date that I went into the hospital, the days I'd be in the hospital, the date I came out, exactly what the problem was, to the T. Now, I've done that for many, many, many people. But in the old days, if you wanted a reading from me, you got one reading, so you wouldn't become addicted to me telling you what the stars might incline and when. It's about timing. That's the reason that I made so much money working with corporations, because it's all about timing for money. If you want to make money, it's all about timing and people.
Oh, I
Yeah,
gotta say
they
something.
had
I
a,
gotta say something. It was even more than that. I was at the hospital. Oh no, don't I look lovely? I've been in the garden. I was in the hospital and they put me in a room and then told me that Douglas was dying and brought in the priest to give him last rites. And I'm sitting there going, no, he doesn't die. No, because I was remembering the reading. Plus, I recorded it, remember?
Yes.
So you're good.
No, it's just that you can read it in the stars. I mean,
well,
it's timing.
I liken it to surfing.
Hmm.
Okay. Now you paddle out, and then there's these waves, and you get on your board and you take the wave in. Now, sometimes you're going to fall off the board, right? But the wave is the wave. The wave happens when it happens. The qualities of time are the qualities of time. What level of consciousness you're at when you approach that is very much your contribution. So you live within the realm of freedom, but it's within the realm of thinking. Say, the creative beings stream into us through that realm. That's the spiritual realm. It's the realm of thinking, right? And manas, and that whole manifestation of manas, and tinged with buddhi. So the buddhi manas, the love wisdom stream. But serving that is that non-creative elemental field, okay, and it does not have creative activity, and the higher realm works into that elemental room, and you're basically figured in between. So it makes a difference as to what state of consciousness you're at when a certain time period happens, when there's a conjunction or a square, and that's basically how it is. As to, it's going to determine how good of a surfer you are, whether you fall off the board or not.
Precisely. The energy's there. What are you going to do with it? So in the old days, I'd gave literally, I said I would not ever charge for a reading until I'd given 10,000 free readings with the card. And I do believe I probably have given way more than 10,000 readings. And essentially, because we do readings where we do, hundreds of people a night, so with the astrology, I would say to people, I'm not going to get caught into this trap of you calling me every day to ask if you invest more money in the stock market, or whether you should go out on the date with this new person, or whether you should get married to them, or when, or why, or how. No, I'm not going to get caught in that. I'm going to give you one reading. It's going to be 3 or 4 hours. You must tape record it so that later you can play it back and always tell me later on whether or not I was accurate, because I'm very egotistic and I want to be 100% accurate. I mean, I wouldn't tell them that, but that's the truth of the matter. So I wanted to know if the system was right. And then I'd know if what I was saying was right, then I'd know whether I can build on it. So they get this big, long 3 hours, 4 hours of taping. I would do their whole past. I'd rectify their chart, tell them where they're at now, tell them about the personality, and tell them what's going to happen, significant events, especially, moving, jobs, trauma, marriage, children, this and that, all into the future, and even predict approximately when they would die and probably what they'd die of, right? So I would meet these people 10 years later and say, by the way, you know what I'm going to ask you? And they'd know, because I asked for a percentage. What percent accurate was I? And they'd tell me, 95 to 100% usually. And then I'd say, and did you follow my advice? And invariably they'd say, no, I did not. So exactly what John said. The wave comes, but if you don't take it, it's just another wave.
Yeah, or if you fall off or whatever. But so there's what's astrocartography, where you it could be more advantageous for you to like move to St. Louis because you're going to have like better event horizon in St. Louis than you would have in Detroit, for example. And so there's that whole dimension of it. But yeah, I remember back in the 80s, there was a special that was about the stock market and all that. And they get this one high level analyst, and he said, well, you know, millionaires use all those graphs and all that, but billionaires use astrology.
I forgot to mention the group across town. Ray Merriman worked for Merrill Lynch. He was one of the best economic advisors at Merrill Lynch because he used astrology, and his book still to this day, he writes a book of predictions for the next year, are so good and so accurate that it's ridiculous. He's well known internationally, well respected. I'd go to these conferences with him and Robert, and people had tremendous respect, still do, for Ray Merriman. And he had a group of astrologers around him, Laura Desjardins and a bunch of others. And they were like this group that was like, you know, they were kind of above us, you know. They were like, you know, we were like these anthroposophic grunts down in the trenches trying to work it out. And they were like, oh no, people from around the world called to ask our opinion, and all this stuff. And they were very, and then we became very good friends with them. And then pretty soon the two groups merged and we all became very, very, very close. So there was a whole bunch of astrologers, and everybody, was talking astrology in those days. So if you couldn't, if somebody says, what's your ascendant? And if you couldn't answer, well, then, you weren't worth talking to. So you had to know astrology. But astrology, here's the deal. For instance, someone asked me to look at someone's chart the other day to see if they were possessed. And I looked and I said, well, they're not possessed, but they look like they're possessed because every negative aspect in their chart is being set off by Neptune. And it affects their ascendant, it affects their sun in the first house, it affects everything. And so, yes, they look like they're possessed, but they're not. But then it came, well, there's drugs involved. And I said, no, they're just having a psychological breakdown. But now, if someone was to look at this person, they easily, matter of fact, they had already condemned her as being possessed and needed an exorcist. So sometimes, the fact that so many people in the modern world look like they are obsessed by demons, possessed by demons. In fact, they could just be having some bad aspects. So astrology is a wonderful tool. So I use that now if I'm actually trying to help somebody. I'll look at the cards. But if I can see that they're having some problems, then I'll look at the astrology, mostly because I'm not clairvoyant anymore, but secondly, because I can then tell them when some relief might be coming.
Yeah, well, you have in the presentation I gave you the excerpt from, it ties into the Gospel of Mark. That Rudolf Steiner says the Gospel of Mark is that, that's Leo, the lion, that's that cosmic element in spiritual science, in understanding scripture. And if you go to the Gospel of Mark, there's a lot of healing that goes in there. And so you say, well, he said that, the doctor was Luke. Well, yeah, from that vantage point, it's all in all of them, but there's a certain emphasis in the way in which it's presented. And for example, in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus Christ would when the sun would go down, that's when he'd go do his healing. And Rudolf Steiner says it's because of the time of day that it was. And so there's this whole idea that the Christ is a true reflection of the cosmos all the time. Okay. And that's part of what's unique about Christ in comparison to all these other people, is that he is this cosmic being who is able to express this cosmic beingness in real time.
When you do an exorcism, you have to figure out the past of the person, the present, and to assess what's going on, and then you have to figure out the future. And the future can only be figured out by them because they have free will. And you can't cast demons out without the willpower and the permission of the person who is possessed. That's not possible unless you were, no, it's not possible. People like to say they are, and the stupid movie that's out now, the what is it called, the Vatican's exorcist or the Pope's exorcist, talking about Gabriella Armroth. Complete and absolute nonsense. That isn't the way that it works. It works because Jesus Christ would speak to. There's to be an exorcist, you don't have to be psychic, only if you want to be effective. You have to be psychic. You have to be able to see what is invisible to most people. You have to be able to sense these beings. You have to be able to confront the beings and not be afraid of them. And let me tell you, about the only way you shouldn't be afraid of these beings is if you're extremely pure and naive. Because once you know who they are and you know the power that they have over other people and the damage they can do you become quite frightened. So literally, it takes somebody who's still got a youth, suffer the little children to come unto me, Christ said. Why? Because they're closer to the spiritual world, because they just came out of the spiritual world, because they were born recently. And a psychic, it's like they never come out of the spiritual world. They're never born into this world. They're still in contact with the pre-birth, still in contact with the after death, and still, as you probably know, John, except when I was being professional, John and I have worked together in numerous circumstances in schools and other things. And so you know the way that I used to be. I never had to write anything down. I remembered everything. I remembered every student's name in the whole school. It didn't matter how many were there. All this stuff, those capacities aren't, that's psychic capacities. That's contacting Christ. Christ is in charge of memory. So when John is spouting all this stuff from his memory, it's not his memory. It's the Christ consciousness. It's the Manasic principle working through us. And that's what we were trying to do in the Manasic Club. That's what I was trying to do with any kind of reading I was doing with astrology. And also, if you're going to study esoteric science, initiation, spiritual initiation, alchemy, hermetics, Rosicrucianism, Masonry, any of it, you have to know astrology. Because astrology isn't just numbers on a page or the planets represented in sigils on a graph. No, 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 no. They are the music of the spheres, the harmony of the spheres. But sometimes that's a misnomer. It's the disharmony of the spheres. And that's when people come to you, is when they have disharmony and they have squares or oppositions or conjunctions that aren't good. And so essentially, what you're doing there is you're reading their script, and their script is written into their etheric body. The whole celestial sphere, before you were born, is condensed into your head, and literally where the planets are at the moment of your birth create the forms, the convolutions of your brain and the structures that are in your brain. That's Rudolf Steiner says that. And because the brain, the head, is basically a picture of your past karma, and it's also a picture of the celestial spheres. And the sphere, and of course, then the planets are in your organs. So each planet, the music of the spheres, the music of the planets, are found in your organs. So if you are a good psychic, if you want to understand your gallbladder, then you need to go to the realm of Mars and talk to those beings and ask why your gallbladder is not functioning. If you want to understand your liver, you go to Jupiter. You understand your spleen, you go to Saturn. Your kidneys, you go to Venus. Your lungs to Mercury, to the sun. If you understand the sun, you have to go to your heart, and so on and so forth. And then there's the 7 organs in your metabolic system. There's the 7 chambers of the heart, which I talk about in my book and also in talks that we've done on the heart. And there are 7 chambers in the head. But the problem is they only know of the 4th ventricle and the insinuation of a 5th. But there's a residual organ where there's actually a hole in your head that they don't know what it is. That's a vent too. That's one of the chambers. and it will develop further in the future. So there are 7 chambers in the brain. And so these 7 planets have correspondences that have absolutely real life effects. As a matter of fact, when you are a clairvoyant and you look at somebody and you look at their liver, well, the first thing you're probably going to see is you're going to check then above their eyes to see if they have liver problems and by the marks between their brow. And then you're going to ask a question. If you're trying to heal them, you're going to say, is this congenital? Is this karmic? Can this be helped? Because just like an astrologer, just like the person, if that person would have come to me and said, they say that I'm possessed, and I want to know, am I possessed by an evil spirit? I would have told her, no, you're not. So when someone would ask, am I ill? What's the illness? You can look in the 6th house. So now I don't have to do all the checking and this and that and going through this whole complicated thing of looking at the aura and the 3 levels of the aura. No, I just look in the 6th house. And if Jupiter's in the 6th house, they have a liver problem, and it's karmic. It probably came from heredity, and depending upon what planet is crossing over it at that moment, it will depend upon how serious, how effective it will be, how bad it will be, or good it will be, and how long it will last. Very simple.
Yeah, but I wouldn't call it a problem so much as a challenge. That it's an indication of something significant, and as far as what that might mean, then you have to get into all the aspects and all of that. But to bring this into focus, Rudolf Steiner talks about also with the brain that you have 12 pairs of cranial nerves, just like there's 12 signs of the zodiac, and that the skull is an image of the cosmos, so to speak. And there's an interesting indication from Rudolf Steiner regarding how the brain itself actually goes through a metamorphosis as a result of the time cycles that we go through. And he talked about the convolutions of the brain and how they were developed during the archangelic period of Gabriel that preceded the age of Michael that we've been in since November of 1879. 1879.
Correct.
Yeah. I get ahead of myself sometimes. But he says, and this is from the contents of Esoteric Studies participants, and this is a piece, a short piece from it on October 23rd, 1907, Esoteric Lesson. He says, the rejection of spiritual wisdom is a sin against the Holy Spirit. Gabriel, that's the Archangel Gabriel, transformed men's brains and an organ developed in the forehead that should be used. If no spiritual content flowed into this part of the brain, it would wither, giving rise to infectious disease and pestilence. Spiritual science was kept secret under Gabriel. This science is supposed to stream out into the open under Michael. Brains are already worked on in the mother's body. When we look at an outside object, it sheds light. That's like the Michaelichrome into our eyes. And this creates a mirror image in the brain. The resulting mental image enables us to perceive the object consciously. In meditation, we have to create the mental image without an outer object. Through the pictures that we create for ourselves, the force of what we've made a picture of can stream into us. We can create such imaginations more easily through the forces that we take into us in esoteric classes. We should take in such teachings with hearty feelings. And so you have this whole meditative understanding of your relationship to the cosmos, because remember, I've said before that when the mystery of Golgotha happened and Christ incarnated, that he rescued the etheric and physical for all mankind, including the criminals, but that the development of the astral and ego components of the human entelechy, that would be the responsibility of the individual to take up that challenge. And so with that understanding, that's a good point to turn another page and thank the genius of Tyler for bringing this all together, and thank Dr. Gabriel for sharing his wisdom with us, and thank all of you for coming by to visit.